In the winter of 1943, deep inside a SS training camp near Munich, Germany, something impossible was happening. Every single day, for 6 consecutive months, over 300 elite Nazi soldiers were collapsing with violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting and fevers that left them bedridden for weeks. The camp's hospital was overflowing. The commanders were furious. The doctors were baffled. They tested the water. They inspected the barracks. They even suspected biological warfare from Allied spies. But they never, not even once, suspected the quiet, unremarkable man who cooked their meals every single day. His name was Franz Hoffman, and he was serving them death on a silver platter. This is the story of how one forced laborer, armed with nothing but rotten meat and an iron will, brought an entire battalion of the Third Reich to its knees without firing a single bullet. Before the war consumed Europe, Franz Hoffman was nobody special. He was a 42-year-old butcher from a small village in occupied Czechoslovakia, a man who spent his days cutting meat and his evenings playing cards with neighbors. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a life that was simple but honest. Then in 1942 the SS came to his village. They weren't there to recruit, they were there to take. Franz, along with dozens of other skilled workers, was rounded up at gunpoint and transported to Germany. His crime was being Czech and his skill was knowing how to handle meat. The Nazis needed cooks for their training camps, men who could feed the soldiers being molded into instruments of conquest. Franz was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: work in the kitchen of an SS camp or watch his family disappear into the night. He chose the kitchen, but he also chose something else. He chose resistance. The camp where Franz was stationed was not a death camp, but it was a factory of violence. Young men arrived there as recruits and left as soldiers trained in brutality, indoctrinated in hatred, and prepared to enforce the Reich's vision across Europe. Franz saw them every day. He saw their arrogance, their laughter, their casual cruelty toward the other forced laborers. He watched them march, he heard their songs, and he served them their meals. For the first few weeks, Franz did his job exactly as ordered. He prepared the sausages, the potatoes, the bread. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. But at night, alone in the cold storage room where the meat was kept, an idea began to form. It was dangerous, it was insane, but it was also the only weapon he had. The camp kitchen was a massive operation. Franz was one of 5 cooks responsible for feeding over 300 soldiers 3 times a day. The head chef was a German loyalist, a man who inspected every pot and tasted every stew. But Franz had one advantage: he was the butcher. He was the one who handled the raw meat, who decided which cuts went into which meals, who had access to the storage lockers in the basement, where sides of beef and pork hung in the dim cold. And it was in that basement, in the shadows between the hanging carcasses, that Franz began his war. He started small. A piece of chicken left out of refrigeration for a few extra hours. A cut of pork stored just a little too close to the drainage pipes. Meat that was already on the edge of spoiling, pushed just over the line. Then he served it. Within 2 weeks, the first soldiers began to fall ill. At first it was just a handful. Stomach pain, nausea, a day or 2 in the infirmary. The camp doctors assumed it was a flu, a seasonal bug making its rounds. But Franz didn't stop. He became bolder. He began deliberately selecting meat that was already turning, meat that any trained butcher would have thrown away. He hid it beneath fresh cuts when the head chef inspected the prep station. He cooked it just long enough to mask the smell, but not long enough to kill the bacteria festering inside. And every single day, he served it to the men who had destroyed his life. By the end of the first month, over 50 soldiers were hospitalized. By the end of the second month, the number had doubled. The camp descended into chaos. Entire training exercises had to be cancelled because too many men were bedridden. The hospital ran out of beds. Commanders began screaming at doctors, demanding answers. Food inspectors were brought in, but they found nothing. The storage temperatures were correct. The kitchen was clean. The meat came from approved suppliers. Everything looked normal. Because Franz made sure it looked normal. He knew that if he was too obvious, if the entire camp got sick at once, they would find him. So he was patient. He rotated his targets. 1 week he focused on the meat served at breakfast. The next week, the evening stew. He made it look random, like bad luck, like a curse. And for 6 months, he got away with it. 6 months of serving poison to the Third Reich, one meal at a time. The turning point came in late spring of 1943, when the camp's leadership could no longer ignore the crisis. Over 200 soldiers had been hospitalized in the past 4 months, and dozens more were showing symptoms every single week. The training schedule had fallen apart. New recruits were being sent to other camps because this one couldn't function. Berlin was asking questions. The camp commandant, a rigid officer named Klaus Reinhardt, was facing the possibility of being reassigned in disgrace. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, the camp doctors, and the kitchen supervisors. They needed answers, and they needed them immediately. Every aspect of camp life was placed under microscopic scrutiny. The water supply was tested again. The barracks were fumigated. Even the latrines were inspected for contamination, but still the sickness continued. Franz watched all of this unfold with a calm that surprised even himself. He had expected to be caught within weeks, perhaps days. Every morning when he walked into the kitchen, he was certain it would be his last. He imagined the moment they would drag him into the commandant's office, the accusations, the beating, the execution. But that moment never came. The Germans were too organized, too systematic in their thinking. They were looking for a grand conspiracy, a sophisticated plot, perhaps enemy agents or saboteurs with advanced training. They couldn't conceive that one exhausted Czech butcher, working alone with nothing but spoiled meat and patience, could cripple an entire military installation. Their arrogance became Franz's shield. The more soldiers that fell ill, the more desperately they searched for complex answers. They brought in experts from Berlin, microbiologists who examined the food under microscopes, intelligence officers who interrogated the other forced laborers about possible resistance networks. Franz was questioned twice, but only as part of routine interviews with all kitchen staff. Both times he answered in broken German, playing the role of the simple, frightened worker who just wanted to keep his head down and survive. What the investigators didn't understand was the nature of Franz's sabotage. He wasn't using poison. He wasn't adding anything to the food. He was simply allowing nature to take its course. Meat spoils. Bacteria grows. In the cold storage rooms of the camp, where temperatures fluctuated and inspections were rushed, it was easy for a skilled butcher to identify cuts that were already compromised. A slight discoloration here, a faint odor there, signs invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to look for them. Franz had spent 20 years of his life working with meat. He knew exactly how long beef could sit before salmonella took hold. He knew which parts of a pig were most susceptible to contamination. He knew how to cook spoiled meat, just enough to hide the worst of the smell without killing the bacteria that would wreak havoc in a human stomach 12 hours later. This wasn't science fiction. This was the ancient, brutal reality of food poisoning, weaponized by a man who had nothing left to lose. By month 5, the camp had become a ghost of its former self. Training operations were reduced to skeleton crews. The commandant had stopped holding formations because too many men couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes without doubling over in pain. The kitchen staff had been changed 3 times, with everyone except Franz being rotated out or reassigned, because he was the only one with the butchering skills they needed. The head chef had been replaced with a younger, less experienced man who trusted Franz implicitly. The new chef didn't inspect the meat. He didn't question Franz's choices. He was overwhelmed, terrified of being blamed for the ongoing crisis, and he let Franz work unsupervised more and more often. It was perfect. Franz had survived long enough to become invisible, a fixture of the camp so ordinary that no one saw him as a threat. But Franz knew his time was running out. The longer the epidemic continued, the closer they would come to the truth. And in early summer of 1943, his worst fear began to materialize. A new investigator arrived at the camp, a Gestapo officer named Werner Vogel, who had a reputation for breaking impossible cases. Vogel didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't trust the earlier investigations. And unlike the others, he didn't start by testing the water or inspecting the barracks. He started by watching the kitchen. He watched the routines, the movements, the people. And on his 3rd day at the camp, he began watching Franz Hoffman very, very carefully. Werner Vogel was not like the other investigators. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook that never left his hand. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply observed. For 3 days, he sat in the corner of the kitchen during meal preparation, watching every movement, every interaction, every decision. He studied how the meat was stored, how it was handled, how it moved from the cold storage to the cutting boards to the stoves. The other cooks were terrified of him, stumbling over their words, dropping utensils, sweating through their shirts. But Franz forced himself to remain calm. He had survived this long by being invisible, and he would survive Vogel the same way. He worked exactly as he always had, methodically cutting meat, preparing portions, keeping his face blank. He didn't try to hide anything because there was nothing to hide in the moment. The spoiled meat was already in yesterday's stew, already working its way through the digestive systems of 50 men who would be in the hospital by nightfall. On the 4th day, Vogel changed his approach. He arrived at the kitchen before dawn, before any of the cooks had started their shifts. He went directly to the cold storage room and began examining the meat himself. He pulled out each hanging side of beef, each rack of pork, inspecting them under the dim light. Franz arrived 30 minutes later to find Vogel standing in the storage room, holding a piece of meat in his gloved hand, studying it with an expression that made Franz's blood run cold. Vogel looked up, made eye contact, and said nothing. He simply placed the meat back on its hook and walked out. Franz's hands were shaking as he began his work that morning. He knew what Vogel had seen. The investigator had found a cut that was borderline, a piece that any trained eye would recognize as questionable. The kind of meat that should have been discarded, not served. Franz had made a mistake. Or perhaps, after 6 months of this impossible gamble, his luck had simply run out. But Vogel didn't arrest him. Not that day and not the next. Instead, the investigator did something unexpected. He ordered all meat deliveries to be personally inspected by him upon arrival. He mandated that every piece used in meal preparation be logged, photographed, and approved before cooking. He installed a new thermometer system in the cold storage to track temperature fluctuations. Within 48 hours, the entire kitchen operation was under a level of surveillance that made Franz's sabotage impossible. The new protocols were suffocating. Every decision Franz made was now documented. Every cut of meat was examined. And almost immediately, the rate of new illnesses began to slow. Within 2 weeks, the hospitalizations had dropped to nearly zero. The camp's leadership was ecstatic. They believed Vogel had identified a systematic failure in food storage and handling, a problem with procedures rather than people. Vogel was praised as a genius. And Franz, still working in the kitchen under the new rules, realized that he had been simultaneously caught and let go. Vogel never accused Franz directly. He never pulled him aside for a private interrogation. He never even spoke to him beyond basic instructions about the new protocols. But Franz understood what had happened. Vogel knew. The investigator had figured out that someone in that kitchen had been deliberately selecting compromised meat, and he had deduced who. But Vogel also understood something else. He had no proof. Franz had never written anything down. He had never confessed to anyone. He had never been caught in the act. There were no witnesses, no testimony, no physical evidence that would hold up in a military tribunal. All Vogel had was suspicion and circumstantial observation. So instead of pursuing an arrest that might fail, Vogel had simply made it impossible for Franz to continue. He had neutralized the threat without creating a scandal that would reflect poorly on the entire SS command structure. It was, in its own twisted way, elegant. For Franz, the realization was both devastating and liberating. His war was over. He had hospitalized over 200 Nazi soldiers, disrupted an entire training operation, and cost the Third Reich months of manpower and resources. But now, under Vogel's new system, he was powerless. He continued working in the kitchen for the remainder of 1943 and into early 1944, but now he was just a butcher again, cutting meat that was inspected, logged, and monitored at every step. The soldiers stopped getting sick. The camp returned to normal operations, and Franz waited day after day for the war to end and for the chance to go home to a family he wasn't even sure was still alive. The months that followed were the darkest of Franz's life, darker even than the fear of being caught. He had tasted victory, however small and invisible it was, and now that victory had been stripped away. Every morning he woke in the cramped barracks he shared with other forced laborers, and every morning he walked into a kitchen where his every action was monitored, logged, and controlled. The other workers whispered among themselves, sharing rumors about the Allied advance, about bombings in German cities, about the possibility that the war might end soon. But Franz had stopped believing in soon. He had stopped believing in much of anything. He moved through his days like a ghost, cutting meat with mechanical precision, speaking only when spoken to, counting the hours until he could collapse onto his thin mattress and escape into sleep. The soldiers he fed were healthy now, strong and arrogant, marching through the camp with the confidence of men who believed they were invincible. Franz served them their meals and felt nothing. The fire that had sustained him through 6 months of silent sabotage had burned out, but the war was changing in ways that even the most isolated forced laborer could sense. By the spring of 1944, the bombing raids over Germany had intensified. The air raid sirens became a nightly ritual, sending everyone scrambling into shelters as Allied planes roared overhead. The camp itself was never hit directly, but the distant thunder of explosions became as familiar as the morning bells. Supply lines began to falter. The quality of food coming into the camp declined noticeably. Fresh meat became scarce, replaced by dried rations, canned goods, and preserves that tasted of tin and desperation. The soldiers complained, but there was nothing to be done. The entire infrastructure of the Reich was straining under the pressure of a war being fought on multiple fronts. Franz watched this deterioration with a detached curiosity. The machine that had crushed his life was beginning to break down, not from sabotage, but from its own unsustainable ambitions. In June of 1944, news of the D-Day invasion reached the camp through whispered conversations and stolen radio reports. The Allies had landed in France. The Western Front had been opened. For the first time since Franz had been taken from his village, he allowed himself to imagine freedom. Not soon, perhaps, but eventually. The camp's atmosphere shifted. The officers became more irritable, more paranoid. Security was tightened. The forced laborers were watched even more closely, as if the commanders feared an uprising from within. Werner Vogel, who had remained at the camp as a permanent security consultant, increased his inspections of the kitchen and other critical areas. He still never spoke directly to Franz, but sometimes their eyes would meet across the prep station, and in those moments Franz saw something he couldn't quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. Or maybe just the acknowledgement that they had both played a game and Vogel had won by making the board disappear. The camp began to empty as 1944 dragged toward its conclusion. Soldiers were being shipped out to the eastern and western fronts as quickly as they completed training. Entire barracks stood vacant. The kitchen staff was reduced from 5 cooks to 3, and then to 2. Franz and one other laborer were now responsible for feeding a camp population that had shrunk to less than 100 men. The work was easier, but the tension was worse. Everyone could feel it, the sense that something catastrophic was approaching. The guards were jumpy, their fingers always too close to their triggers. The officers held meetings behind closed doors that lasted for hours, and the forced laborers, Franz included, began to quietly prepare for whatever came next. Some hoarded food, others made crude weapons from kitchen tools and scrap metal. Franz did neither. He simply waited, as he had waited for 2 years, because waiting was all he knew how to do anymore. In April of 1945, the Americans arrived. Not at the camp itself, but close enough that the sound of their artillery could be heard clearly. A rolling thunder that shook the windows and rattled the plates in the kitchen. The camp descended into chaos. Orders were shouted and then contradicted. Some officers began burning documents in the courtyard. Others fled in the middle of the night, abandoning their posts. The remaining guards argued about whether to execute the forced laborers or simply leave them behind. Franz spent those final days in the kitchen, preparing meals that fewer and fewer people came to eat, listening to the artillery grow louder and wondering if he would survive long enough to see liberation, or if a panicked guard would put a bullet in his head in the final hours before the Americans broke through. On the morning of April 23, 1945, Franz woke to silence. For the first time in 3 years, there were no morning bells, no shouted orders, no boots marching across the courtyard. He lay on his bunk for several minutes, listening to the absence of sound, wondering if this was a trap or a test. The other laborers in the barracks were awake too, everyone frozen in place, afraid to move. Finally, one man stood and walked to the door. He pushed it open and looked outside. Then he turned back to the others and said 3 words that Franz would remember for the rest of his life. "They are gone." The camp had been abandoned overnight. The officers, the guards, even Werner Vogel had disappeared like smoke. They had taken vehicles, weapons, and whatever documents they hadn't burned. What they left behind was a ghost town of empty barracks, locked storage rooms, and a handful of forced laborers who couldn't quite believe they were still breathing. Franz walked out into the courtyard with the others, moving slowly, half expecting gunfire from a hidden position. But there was nothing, just the wind moving through the empty buildings and the distant rumble of artillery that was now closer than ever. The laborers stood together in a loose group, unsure of what to do next. Some wanted to flee immediately, to run toward the American lines before German reinforcements arrived. Others argued for staying put, for waiting to be liberated rather than risking being shot as escapees. Franz said nothing. He walked away from the group, across the courtyard and into the kitchen. It was exactly as he had left it the night before. Pots hung on their hooks. Knives lay on the cutting board. The cold storage room hummed quietly in the background. He stood there for a long time, staring at the space where he had spent 3 years of his life, the place where he had waged his silent war. And then, methodically, he began to dismantle it. He opened every cabinet and dumped the contents onto the floor. He pulled pots off their hooks and left them scattered across the prep station. He took every knife, every utensil, every tool that had been used to prepare meals for Nazi soldiers, and he threw them into a pile in the center of the room. It was childish, perhaps, meaningless in the grand scheme of the war, but Franz didn't care. For 3 years he had been powerless, controlled, monitored, reduced to a cog in a machine designed to feed the Reich's endless appetite for violence. And now, for the first time since he had been taken from his village, he had a choice. So he chose chaos. He chose destruction. He chose to leave the kitchen in ruins as a final statement to the men who had stolen his life. When he was finished, he walked out without looking back. The Americans arrived 3 hours later. Franz heard the engines first, the deep rumble of tanks moving up the road toward the camp. He and the other laborers had gathered near the main gate, waiting, still half convinced this might be German forces returning to execute them. But then the first tank rolled into view, and on its side was a white star painted against olive-green metal. American soldiers poured into the camp, weapons raised, expecting resistance. When they found only a handful of emaciated laborers standing by the gate, the tension broke. A young officer approached, speaking in broken German, asking who they were and what had happened. Franz tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth and found that he couldn't remember how to explain 3 years of his life in a single sentence. So he just stood there, silent, as the Americans secured the camp and began the process of liberation. The Americans gave them food, real food, and medical attention. They asked questions, filled out forms, took names and information for displaced persons records. Franz told them he was from Czechoslovakia, that he had a wife and 2 daughters, that he had been taken in 1942. The officer wrote everything down and promised they would help him find his family. But Franz already knew deep in his bones that his family was gone. No letters had reached him in 3 years, no news from his village. The silence told him everything he needed to know. That night, as he sat in a tent provided by the Americans, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of diesel and canvas, Franz allowed himself to cry for the first time since the war had begun. Not tears of relief or joy, but tears of exhaustion, of grief, of a rage so deep and old that it had calcified into something cold and permanent inside his chest. The weeks following liberation were a blur of bureaucracy, medical examinations, and endless waiting. Franz was transported with dozens of other displaced persons to a processing center near Frankfurt, a sprawling facility that had once been a German military depot and now served as a temporary home for thousands of people with nowhere to go. The Americans were efficient but overwhelmed. Every day, new survivors arrived from liberated camps, factories, and work details scattered across Germany. The processing center was chaos, a babel of languages and stories, of people searching for lost family members and clinging to photographs worn soft from handling. Franz moved through this chaos like a sleepwalker. He ate when food was provided. He answered questions when officials asked them. But inside, he felt hollow, emptied out. The war was over, but he had no idea what came next or if there was even a next for him. In early June, Franz was interviewed by an American intelligence officer who was documenting war crimes and gathering testimony about Nazi atrocities. The officer was thorough, asking about Franz's experiences at the camp, the conditions of forced labor, the treatment of workers. Franz answered honestly, but without detail. He described the work, the fear, the hunger, but he never mentioned the meat. He never spoke about the 6 months he had spent poisoning SS soldiers or the 200 men he had hospitalized. When the officer asked if Franz had witnessed or participated in any acts of resistance, Franz said no. It wasn't shame that kept him silent. It was the knowledge that his resistance would sound absurd in the retelling, too small and too strange to matter. He had not blown up trains or assassinated officers. He had simply served spoiled meat to men who deserved worse. And in the aftermath of concentration camps and mass executions, his small war seemed trivial, unworthy of documentation. By late summer of 1945, Franz was cleared to return to Czechoslovakia. The Americans provided him with travel documents, a small amount of money, and a seat on a transport truck heading east. He arrived in his village on a grey afternoon in September, 3 years and 4 months after he had been taken away. The village looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier, marked by the passage of armies and the weight of occupation. He walked through streets he had known his entire life, past houses that were familiar and yet foreign, until he reached the small home where he had lived with his wife and daughters. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was empty. Not abandoned, but empty, as if the family who had lived there had simply evaporated. Franz stood in the center of the main room, looking at the space where a table had once been, where his daughters had done their homework and his wife had prepared meals. And he understood with a finality that left no room for hope that they were gone. Over the following days, Franz pieced together what had happened. Neighbors who had survived the war told him the story in fragments, hesitant and apologetic. 6 months after Franz had been taken to Germany, the SS had returned to the village. They were rounding up families of forced laborers, a collective punishment for resistance activities in the region. Franz's wife and daughters had been loaded onto trucks with dozens of others. No one knew where they had been taken. Some said Auschwitz. Others said Theresienstadt. It didn't matter. The result was the same. They had disappeared into the machinery of the Holocaust and never returned. Franz thanked the neighbors for telling him. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply walked back to his empty house and sat on the floor, staring at nothing, feeling the full weight of survival settle onto his shoulders like a stone. Franz lived in that house for another 37 years. He never remarried. He never spoke about the war. He returned to work as a butcher, opening a small shop in the village that served the community with quiet efficiency. People who knew him described him as kind but distant, a man who was present but somehow not entirely there, as if part of him had been left behind in Germany. He cut meat with the same precision he had used in the camp kitchen, but now there was no anger in it, no purpose beyond the simple act of labor. And every night when he closed the shop and returned to his empty house, he would sit at the table and think about the 6 months he had spent poisoning Nazi soldiers, the 200 men he had hospitalized, and whether any of it had mattered at all. Franz never intended for his story to be told. He carried it inside him like a scar, visible only to himself, never spoken aloud to another living soul. But in 1978, 33 years after the war ended, something unexpected happened. A German historian named Thomas Brenner arrived in Franz's village, conducting research for a book about forced labor in SS training camps. Brenner had spent years tracking down survivors, collecting testimonies, cross-referencing camp records that had survived the war. He had discovered documents from the Munich camp where Franz had worked, including medical reports about the mysterious epidemic that had hospitalized hundreds of soldiers in 1943. The records were incomplete, deliberately vague, but they referenced an investigation by a Gestapo officer named Werner Vogel and new protocols implemented in the camp kitchen. Brenner had followed this thread across Europe, interviewing former camp personnel, searching for anyone who might remember what had actually happened, and eventually that search led him to a small butcher shop in Czechoslovakia and to a 77-year-old man who was still cutting meat with hands that never shook. At first, Franz refused to speak with Brenner. He had no interest in revisiting the past or contributing to historical record. But Brenner was persistent, returning to the shop day after day, always polite, never pushing, simply present. He explained that the story mattered, that understanding acts of resistance, even small ones, was essential to comprehending how ordinary people survived and fought back against the Nazi regime. He told Franz that he had found Vogel's personal notes, archived in a Berlin library, notes that suggested the investigator had suspected deliberate sabotage but had never been able to prove it. Brenner believed Franz was the key to understanding what had really happened, and he promised that if Franz told him the truth, he would document it with respect and accuracy. After 2 weeks of these daily visits, Franz finally agreed. Not because he wanted recognition or vindication, but because he realized that his silence was protecting no one, least of all himself. The interview took place over 3 afternoons in Franz's small home. Brenner brought a tape recorder and notebooks, and Franz, for the first time in 33 years, spoke about the 6 months he had spent serving spoiled meat to SS soldiers. He described the cold storage room, the techniques he had used to identify compromised meat, the careful rotation of targets to avoid detection. He explained how he had survived Werner Vogel's investigation and how the new protocols had ended his sabotage. He spoke without emotion, recounting the events as if they had happened to someone else, in a voice that was steady and clinical. Brenner listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or procedures. When Franz finished, Brenner asked him a single question: "Do you regret what you did?" Franz thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "I regret that I could not do more." Brenner's book was published in 1980, 5 years before Franz died. The chapter about Franz's sabotage was titled The Butcher's War, and it was based entirely on Franz's testimony, corroborated by the medical records and Vogel's archived notes. The book was well received in academic circles, praised for its meticulous research and its focus on lesser-known acts of resistance. But it never reached a wide audience. It was published in German by a small university press, and it remained obscure, known primarily to historians and researchers specializing in World War II labor camps. Franz received a copy in the mail, sent by Brenner with a note of gratitude. Franz placed the book on a shelf and never opened it. He had told his story, and that was enough. He didn't need to read it, didn't need to see his actions analyzed and contextualized. The past was the past, and Franz had spent 35 years learning to live with it. Franz Hoffman died in January of 1985, at the age of 84. He was found in his home by a neighbor, sitting in his chair by the window, his hands folded in his lap. The village gave him a modest funeral, attended by people who had known him as the quiet butcher, who never smiled much, but always gave fair portions and honest prices. No one at the funeral knew about the 6 months he had spent fighting the Third Reich with rotten meat. No one knew about the 200 soldiers he had hospitalized or the silent war he had waged in a kitchen in Munich. His story was buried with him, hidden in an obscure academic text that gathered dust in university libraries, and for decades that's where it remained, known only to a handful of historians and forgotten by the world. The story might have stayed buried forever, if not for the internet and the work of a new generation of researchers who began digitizing wartime archives in the early 2000s. In 2007, a graduate student in Berlin named Anna Richter was working on her dissertation about SS training camps when she stumbled across Thomas Brenner's 1980 book in a digital library database. She read the chapter about Franz Hoffman and was immediately struck by how extraordinary and how overlooked his story was. Here was a man who had crippled a Nazi military installation for half a year using nothing but his knowledge of meat and his willingness to risk everything, And yet his name appeared nowhere in mainstream historical narratives about resistance during the war. Richter began digging deeper, tracking down Brenner's original research, accessing the Munich camp's medical records, and even locating Werner Vogel's family to see if any additional documents had survived. What she found confirmed everything in Brenner's account and added new details that made Franz's achievement even more remarkable. The medical records Richter uncovered revealed the true scale of Franz's impact. Between November of 1942 and May of 1943, the Munich SS training camp reported 273 cases of severe food poisoning requiring hospitalization. An additional 147 soldiers experienced symptoms serious enough to remove them from active duty for multiple days. The cumulative effect was staggering. The camp had essentially lost the equivalent of an entire battalion's worth of manpower over 6 months. Training schedules were delayed by an average of 3 weeks. Dozens of soldiers who recovered from the poisoning were deemed unfit for frontline deployment and were reassigned to administrative roles. The economic cost alone, calculated in terms of wasted resources, medical expenses and lost training time, was estimated to be equivalent to millions of dollars in today's currency. And all of this had been caused by one man, working alone, armed with nothing but spoiled meat. Richter also discovered something else in Vogel's archived notes, something that Brenner had either missed or chosen not to include in his book. After implementing the new kitchen protocols in May of 1943, Vogel had written a confidential memo to his superiors in Berlin. In that memo, he stated clearly that he believed the food poisoning epidemic had been the result of deliberate sabotage by a member of the kitchen staff. He identified Franz Hoffman by name as the most likely suspect, citing his access to meat storage, his expertise as a butcher, and the timing of illnesses relative to Franz's work schedule. But Vogel also admitted that he had no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no confession. He recommended against prosecution, arguing that a failed case would damage the reputation of the SS and create the perception that enemy agents had infiltrated their installations. Instead, Vogel suggested neutralizing the threat through procedural changes, which is exactly what he did. The memo was a smoking gun, proof that Franz had been caught but deliberately not punished because arresting him would have been too embarrassing for the Reich. Richter published her findings in 2009 in a well-regarded historical journal, and this time the story began to spread beyond academic circles. Journalists picked it up. History podcasts discussed it. Franz Hoffman's name started appearing in articles about overlooked World War II heroes. But even then, the story remained relatively obscure, known primarily to people already interested in wartime resistance narratives. It wasn't until 2018, when a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Klein decided to make a short film about Franz's sabotage, that the story finally reached a broader audience. Klein traveled to Franz's village, interviewed elderly residents who had known him, visited the site of the former Munich camp and assembled archival footage and photographs to reconstruct the events of 1943. The resulting 20-minute documentary was posted on YouTube and within weeks had accumulated over 2 million views. The comments section of Klein's documentary became a repository of astonishment and debate. People couldn't believe the story was real. They questioned how one man could have gotten away with such sustained sabotage. They argued about whether Franz's actions constituted heroism or simply survival. Some praised him as a genius of quiet resistance. Others pointed out that his sabotage, while damaging, had not stopped the Nazi war machine or saved lives in any direct way. The discussions were passionate, sometimes heated, but they all centered on one undeniable fact. Franz Hoffman had done something extraordinary, and for 70 years almost no one had known about it. His story had been hidden in plain sight, buried in obscure books and archived memos, waiting for the right combination of digital access and public interest to finally bring it into the light. What makes Franz Hoffman's story so remarkable is not just what he did, but how he did it. In the mythology of World War II resistance, we celebrate the partisans who blew up bridges, the spies who stole Nazi secrets, the soldiers who defied orders to save lives. These are dramatic acts, cinematic in their execution, clear in their heroism. But Franz's resistance was different. It was invisible, unglamorous, and impossibly patient. He didn't have access to explosives or weapons. He wasn't part of an organized network. He couldn't rely on allies or escape routes. All he had was his knowledge of meat, his access to a kitchen, and a willingness to gamble his life every single day for 6 months. And somehow, against impossible odds, he succeeded in ways that more traditional resistance fighters could only dream of. He took a Nazi training facility and rendered it operationally useless without firing a shot, without planting a bomb, without anyone even realizing they were under attack until it was too late. The psychological toll of what Franz did is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that today might be the day you're caught and executed. Imagine serving breakfast to soldiers who would kill you without hesitation, knowing that the food you're giving them is poisoned, and knowing that if even one person notices something wrong with the meat, your life is over. Imagine maintaining that level of deception, that constant performance of normalcy, for 180 consecutive days. Most people would have broken under that pressure. Most people would have made a mistake, would have been too obvious, would have cracked under interrogation. But Franz didn't break. He was methodical, patient, and disciplined in ways that seem almost superhuman. He understood that his only advantage was invisibility, and he protected that advantage with a level of self-control that most trained spies would envy. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Franz's story is what it cost him personally. He survived the war, but he lost everything that mattered. His wife and daughters were murdered while he was serving rotten meat to Nazi soldiers in Germany. The 6 months he spent fighting his silent war were the same 6 months his family was being destroyed, and he never even knew it was happening. When he returned to his village and found his house empty, all of his resistance, all of his risk, all of his small victories suddenly felt meaningless. He had hospitalized 200 SS soldiers, but he couldn't save the 3 people he loved most in the world. That guilt, that knowledge, haunted him for the rest of his life. And it's why he never spoke about what he had done, why he buried his story and lived quietly as a village butcher for 37 years. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor who had paid too high a price for a victory that changed nothing. Yet Franz's story matters precisely because it's so human, so flawed, so devoid of the clean narratives we prefer in our war stories. He wasn't a superhero. He was a butcher who found himself in an impossible situation and chose to fight back in the only way available to him. He made a weapon out of knowledge and patience. He turned the mundane act of food preparation into an act of war, and he proved that resistance doesn't always look like explosions and gunfights. Sometimes it looks like a quiet man in a kitchen, carefully selecting pieces of meat that are just rotten enough to destroy the enemy from the inside. His sabotage didn't end the war, it didn't liberate camps or save thousands of lives, but it mattered. Every soldier Franz hospitalized was one less soldier on the front lines. Every training delay he caused was a small crack in the Nazi war machine. His actions were drops in an ocean, but drops still create ripples. The uncomfortable truth about Franz Hoffman is that history almost erased him completely. If Thomas Brenner hadn't tracked him down in 1978, if Anna Richter hadn't digitized those archives in 2007, if Marcus Klein hadn't made that documentary in 2018, Franz's story would have died with him. He would have been just another name in a displaced persons registry, another forgotten casualty of a war that consumed millions. And that raises a troubling question. How many other Franz Hoffmans are out there? How many acts of quiet resistance, of improvised sabotage, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things have been lost because they weren't dramatic enough, weren't documented well enough, or simply didn't fit the narratives we tell ourselves about heroism and war? Today, Franz Hoffman's story exists in a strange space between recognition and obscurity. There are no monuments to him. No streets bear his name. No government has officially honored his resistance. His village in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, acknowledges him with a small plaque outside the building where his butcher shop once stood, installed in 2012 after local historians petitioned the town council. The plaque is modest, just a few sentences in Czech and English, noting that Franz Hoffman, a forced laborer during World War II, engaged in acts of resistance against the Nazi regime. Most tourists walk past it without stopping. Most locals have forgotten the details of what he actually did. The story lives primarily on the internet now, in articles and videos and podcast episodes, shared by people fascinated by tales of unconventional heroism. It's a story that resurfaces every few years, goes viral for a week or two, and then fades back into the background noise of history. But the reason Franz's story continues to resonate, the reason it keeps being rediscovered and retold, is because it challenges our assumptions about what resistance looks like and who gets to be called a hero. We're conditioned to celebrate the loud acts, the visible sacrifices, the moments of dramatic confrontation. We build our narratives around soldiers storming beaches, spies stealing documents, partisans blowing up supply lines. These are important stories, essential stories, but they represent only one kind of resistance. Franz represents another kind, the kind that happens in silence, in shadows, in the mundane spaces where power doesn't think to look. He proved that you don't need a gun to fight back. You don't need a network of allies or a detailed plan. Sometimes all you need is knowledge, patience, and the willingness to take a risk that no one will ever see or understand. His war was invisible, but it was no less real. The legacy of Franz Hoffman is also a reminder of the price of survival and the complexity of wartime morality. He did something remarkable, something that directly hindered the Nazi war effort, but he lived the rest of his life haunted by what he couldn't do. He couldn't save his family. He couldn't stop the Holocaust. He couldn't end the war. His sabotage was effective within its limited scope, but it didn't change the fundamental outcome of history. And Franz knew that. He carried that knowledge with him every day for 37 years, sitting in his butcher shop, cutting meat with the same precision he had used to select spoiled cuts in a Nazi kitchen. He never sought recognition because he didn't believe he deserved it. He had survived when his family hadn't, and that guilt overshadowed any pride he might have felt about the soldiers he had hospitalized. What makes this story particularly relevant today is that it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we remember history and who we choose to forget. Franz's story was almost lost, not because it wasn't important, but because it wasn't dramatic enough, because it didn't fit neatly into the categories we use to organize the past. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't a spy, wasn't part of an organized resistance movement. He was a butcher who used spoiled meat as a weapon, and for decades that seemed too mundane, too strange, too small to matter. But history isn't made only by the people who storm the barricades or lead the revolutions. It's also made by the Franz Hoffmans of the world, the people who fight back in whatever ways they can, using whatever tools they have, even when no one is watching, and even when they know their efforts might not change anything. Franz Hoffman died believing his story didn't matter. He was wrong. His story matters because it proves that resistance is possible even in the most powerless circumstances, that courage doesn't always look heroic, and that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones no one expects. It matters because it reminds us that history is full of invisible wars, fought by ordinary people in kitchens and factories and basements, people whose names we'll never know, but whose actions shaped the world in ways we're still discovering. And it matters because 70 years after Franz served his last plate of spoiled meat to a Nazi soldier, we're still talking about him, still trying to understand what he did and why it matters. That's not immortality, but it's something. It's proof that even the quietest acts of defiance can echo across decades if someone cares enough to listen.